And you talk a little bit about how one of the challenges of analytic thinking is an inherent skepticism of, wait a second, why should I believe this? And that kind of perspective can also often undermine authority, which is, I think, really important when you're looking at from a scientific perspective. Science, one of the great lines is that science is true whether you believe in it or not. You're designed to be impersonal in that way, but that isn't necessarily the right framework when you are at a wedding or at any kind of ritual there. Well, why does somebody need to put this particular object in this particular place at this particular time? There's no necessarily objective reason to do that, but there's a social function as well.
That's sort of part of what we're also arguing in the chapter, is that there are actually moments where social groups where analytical thinking is definitely the right way to go. So like if you're in a cosmopolitan setting, you're interacting with a bunch of different people who you might or might not see again. You can't really assume that you and these people share the same sort of set of norms. So your best way of interacting is going to be sort of at this analytical mode where nothing is taken for granted. You're not sort of adopting these tacit norms. But there's also other sort of social organizations that are, well, in the chapter we call it sort of dense sociality. So in these forms of groups, you have a lot of tacit sort of understanding about the way things are. You have a lot of obligations to each other, and that mode of cooperating and interacting in the group is incredibly complex. Like if you had to parse all of the interactions and the costs and benefit of helping so-and-so now so that they'll help me later, like the calculus of that would get way too complex for us to handle. But intuitively, we're very effective at handling that and like managing our own reputation and who to trust and who not to trust. And so part of what we're trying to highlight is that oftentimes religiosity fosters this sort of social density. Not always, like you can definitely be in religious groups that are highly individualistic and sort of foster a sort of analytical thinking. But oftentimes being religious means being involved in a community where you're sort of accepting these tacit norms and abiding by them. And there are a lot of advantages to that. And so that's one of the reasons why we would expect being part of that community to actually foster a sort of intuitive way of approaching the world. And that intuitive way would be pretty functional and strategic within that setting. Like it would pay off in the long run. And if you are in that setting and are very analytically minded, I think that sort of comes across as challenging these identities and challenging everyone else's trust and reliance in the group. So sometimes that can be like a very dangerous, metaphorically, I guess, position to be in. You're going to stand out. It's going to be uncomfortable.
So another question I wanted to ask, this is a line that a lot of innovators use, and I take it from one of my teachers, Rabbi Erwin Kula, who asks that really any kind of question from a business perspective, from a scientific perspective, from a religious perspective is, what's the job this gets done and for whom? And those are going to be different questions for different places and in different communities. Being able to say, I want to be skeptical about every single claim that's a great job to get done in the scientific community. It's not going to be so valuable at a wedding. You're not going to say, well, wait a second, are you actually married? Can you prove to me that you're married? So how does that play into some of your research here about individualism and the community and intuitive thinking and analytic thinking? What's the job in your mind each of those gets done, and do they get a different job done for different people?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of parsing the different roles that intuitive or holistic versus analytical thinking play in our lives, because they do play different roles for different folks at different times. When like Jonathan was just saying, if you're in a market setting, a cosmopolitan setting, a trading port, Midtown Manhattan, Cambridge, Massachusetts, places where there are many different cultures from many different backgrounds all sort of interacting at once, people aren't going to share the normal, tacit background assumptions that you do if you're all part of one community. So you have to sort of lower the amount that you rely on intuitive expectations in order to be able to interact helpfully, to take, and that sort of market oriented social surrounding is also really important for science. I mean, science really got going in Europe after the Renaissance, often in trading settings, right? Like the Northern European cities where you had ports where people would come in and out with all these different goods and services, and so I think that's a setting where analytic thinking really does a great job. It's you need to be able to question your assumptions and focus on things that everybody can objectively agree on. Whether I speak Dutch and you speak Portuguese, we can both agree that these tulips are valuable and that gold is also valuable, and we can exchange them in our broken versions of each other's languages. What intuitive thinking is good for, and this is not something directly that we have in the chapter. This is actually a project that I'm pursuing right now on a separate paper that's forthcoming later this year with my colleague John Shaver at the University of Otago in New Zealand. Intuitive thinking helps institutional thinking. It helps us to deal with institutions, and which are in the thought of the philosopher John Searle, institutions are social facts, beliefs that we have that are not based on objective reality, but which instead we co-create through performance and obligation and what he calls status functions. So you can have, you could have a room that's just a bunch of walls and a door, but if you treat it like a courtroom, and you say, and then somebody comes in wearing robes and then bangs a gavel and says, "Court is in session," right? That's an illocutionary act, as John Austin called it. It's a thing that we say that only by saying it is automatically true, if it's said by the right person in the right context. So I now pronounce you husband and wife. That's another version of an illocutionary act. When the officiant at a wedding says that, it is automatically true by tautology at that moment. So these types of behaviors, these institutional behaviors where we co-create something that didn't exist in the objective world before that, that's what makes human sociality possible. That's the difference between humans and chimpanzees and gorillas, right? Gorillas and chimpanzees have social emotions. Sometimes they even cooperate a little bit. They have reciprocity, right? Like, I'll groom you and you'll groom me, but neither one of us will groom that guy over there because we don't like him, right? They have these bands and cohorts and alliances. Humans have badges. We have roles. We have statuses that are not reducible to dominance, right? The only role differences in a chimpanzee band is I'm the alpha, you're the omega, watch out, right? Or whatever. It's dominance. We have lawyers, priests, professors, husbands, wives, teachers, students. We have these roles that are abstract, that you can move into and out of, and that remain the same even as people move in and out of them. So my contention, and I think in that separate paper, and Jonathan and I in our chapter that was just published, argue that way of dealing with the world, co-creating a reality, that depends on some level of intuitive thinking. Why? Because you have to accept that it's true before it even happens, right? If you say, I now pronounce you husband and wife, and I say, yeah, prove it, well, like at some level, if everybody says, yeah, prove it, it's not going to be true. You have to have a certain level of acceptance.